Welcome to The Critique. So the analysis we're looking at today digs into the really complex roots of mass shootings in the U.S. It connects these pervasive psychological traits you see in perpetrators, like lack of empathy, a strong victim mentality. It connects those to modern educational culture, specifically the overemphasis on, unconditional self-esteem.
Right.
And we should say up front, the psychological profiling here, drawing on people like Dietz, Mullen, Peterson, it's deep. And that specific link made to the "you are perfect the way you are" idea, that's a really powerful, insightful foundation we're starting with.
Absolutely. That's the right place to begin. The diagnostic work is exceptionally strong. Yeah, it maps out the psychological terrain very clearly. But given that this is aiming to be, a robust piece, something academic, maybe even policy driving, we just need to ensure the arguments are, as resistant to easy rebuttal as possible.
Okay, so let's focus on that cultural root then. The analysis makes a pretty compelling case that this self-esteem culture can lead to entitlement, victim mentality. How do we really bulletproof that argument against people saying, okay, but that's too narrow?
That's critical, yeah. Because the problem itself is just so vast, and any critique that looks like it's blaming just one cultural trend, even if it's accurate, it can get sidelined pretty quickly.
Right.
So the material can maximize its academic robustness by preemptively addressing potential counter-arguments and mitigating factors to the cultural critique of, you are perfect the way you are.
Okay, so the concern, as I understand it from the notes, is that the analysis right now, it risks feeling a bit too selective?
That's the potential weakness, yes. The current analysis puts forward a very strong argument, but maybe a bit narrow? It really heavily emphasizes the self-esteem movement as the kind of primary cultural root. And while that concept is definitely relevant, focusing so intensely on it, it risks simplifying what's really a complex issue, this modern youth pathology. If the author doesn't nod to the wider environment, critics might just dismiss the whole thing.
Okay.
They might say it's, a single-factor explanation, maybe politically charged social commentary, instead of the comprehensive psychological analysis it clearly wants to be. You want the reader thinking, yes, this factor's crucial, not, okay, but what about X, Y, and Z?
I see what you're getting at. But here's a question. If you start bringing in all these other systemic issues, things like social alienation, economic precarity, maybe cultural fragmentation, doesn't that risk diluting the psychological focus? I thought the whole point was to isolate the mechanism leading to violence, and the author seems to really nail that with the failure of resilience.
That's a far challenge, absolutely. And the suggestion for improvement isn't about diluting the focus, not at all. It's about contextualizing it. The analysis needs to explicitly integrate or at least acknowledge those other widely discussed systemic issues.
Okay.
Right. And then explain why this self-esteem and entitlement cycle still acts as the central psychological mechanism, the thing that translates those broader societal pressures, economic stress, alienation, whatever, into externalized violence and that victim mentality. The economic stress isn't necessarily the direct cause, maybe, but it's the external pressure that the fragile self-esteem just can't handle.
Right. That's a really key distinction. Cause versus like a facilitating condition. That actually strengthens the argument, doesn't it? It brings those other factors under the main thesis, instead of seeming to ignore them.
Precisely. We need to show very clearly why this specific psychological deficit acts as the bridge, between general social strain and this kind of explosive behavior. So for concrete examples, maybe the author could explicitly frame the self-esteem movement not as the sole cause, but as a facilitating cultural condition, something that dramatically weakens the individual's psychological immune system, making them vulnerable to those external stressors.
Like saying A accelerates C, especially when B is present, rather than just A causes C.
Exactly that. And you mentioned broadening the academic language slightly?
I did, yeah.
Yes. Briefly touching on related academic concepts could help. Things like toxic positivity, that cultural pressure to always feel good about yourself no matter what, or maybe the broader pathology of individualism, Just bringing those in briefly helps ensure the critique resonates beyond just one specific educational trend. It shows the research is really aware of the wider scholarly conversation happening around it.
Okay. That framing definitely makes the analysis feel much more robust, more defensible. Let's shift gears then and look closely at the section on interventions. The policy recommendations are strong, I thought. Particularly things like resilience training, ethics education, they seem to address the core deficits we were just discussing.
Yeah, the quality of the actual suggestions is high, definitely, but the packaging maybe needs a bit of work.
To really elevate the persuasive force of the policy memo, the structure of the proposed educational reforms should be reorganized to explicitly mirror the specific psychological deficits they are designed to counteract.
Okay, so tell me more about the weakness there. What's wrong with the current structural layout?
Well, right now, the policy suggestions teaching resilience, fostering empathy, promoting a growth mindset, all good things. They're just listed sequentially, almost like a menu of general good educational goals.
Right, and this prevents the reader, especially, a busy policymaker, from immediately seeing the direct systemic link between the problem identified earlier, that psychological triad of lack of empathy, victim mentality, desire for infamy, and the specific intervention designed to fix that specific problem. Without that really clear direct link, the solutions can feel a bit generalized, not like targeted policy prescriptions flowing directly from the forensic psychology work done in the earlier section.
So the structure itself is kind of undermining the clinical rigor of the recommendations. Why is that structural link so crucial in a policy document, do you think?
Well, I think it transforms the document from just an academic exercise into something more like a clinical prescription. A policymaker needs to see A leads to B, therefore we prescribe C.
Okay, that makes sense.
If they don't see that really tight linkage, they might just cherry-pick policies or maybe dilute the intent. So the suggestion for improvement is actually pretty simple, but rhetorically quite powerful. Restructure Section 4 of the memo. Use those 3 core psychological characteristics of the shooter, which the material identified brilliantly back in Section 2. Use those as clear subheadings, then place the corresponding policy recommendations directly underneath each one.
Right, so it creates this immediate, visible contract. Here's the specific problem, and right here is the tailored solution for it. Can you give us a couple of concrete examples of how that might look?
Sure. We can use the core deficits identified. For example, you could create a really strong subheading like countering the victim mentality and external blame.
Okay.
And right under that, you anchor the suggestion for implementing systematic frustration response and conflict resolution courses. See? The justification for that specific course, forcing individuals to cope with negative outcomes internally, it becomes instantly clear why it's there.
And for the other deficits, like empathy?
Same idea. Maybe a subheading like addressing moral deficiency and cold indifference. And then under that, you place the suggestion for integrating empathy and ethical responsibility into core curriculum. The purpose just becomes undeniable. The key is making the structure do some of the heavy lifting presentationally. The layout itself needs to almost scream, look, this policy isn't just a nice to have. It's the direct countermeasure to the pathology we've identified.
That definitely boosts the professional feel and the persuasive flow. Okay, finally, let's turn to what I thought was one of the most compelling parts of this analysis, the finding that mass shootings often function as performance crimes, driven by this desire for unending infamy.
Yes, crucial point.
The material suggested media literacy as a key countermeasure here. But I'm wondering, is that really enough? Is that an adequate response to such a deep, powerful motivation?
That's a critical question to ask, yeah. Especially because this desire for infamy often feels like the final, high-stakes psychological driver pushing someone over the edge. The analysis powerfully identifies this desire for infamy, and it correctly points out that shooters often get radicalized in these dark corners of the internet, where they sort of consume and refine their own heroic script.
Right.
However, the material should deepen its exploration of the performance crime motivation by extending policy suggestions beyond traditional media controls to address the digital ecosystems where the pathology of seeking infamy is actually validated.
So the weakness here, then, is that the current solution, media literacy, reporting guidelines, it mostly focuses on the output, like how the media reports the crime after it happens,
Exactly.
rather than the inputs, the online validation system that's fueling the motivation before the crime ever occurs.
Precisely. The policy solution currently leans heavily on media literacy and post-event reporting guidelines. And look, those things are necessary, they help prevent copycats, but it largely overlooks that critical stage before the crime where the shooter's narrative gets incubated, validated, amplified. It's that online ecosystem, that sort of recruitment and glorification space that satisfies the pathological need for attention. Just relying on traditional media reporting guidelines doesn't really touch the root of that.
Okay, so the suggestion has to be about proactive systemic intervention in the digital space. But that's tricky territory, isn't it? Politically, socially. Platform regulation immediately brings up debates about free speech, government overreach. What's the most actionable, maybe implementable policy suggestion they could make here? Something that addresses the online validation, but doesn't instantly hit that political wall.
That's the needle we have to thread, absolutely. The suggestion from Proveman is to expand the policy scope to specifically target those dark corners of the internet, as the author puts it, where this heroic script gets formed. This means proposing systemic interventions against the mechanisms online that satisfy that pathological need for attention and validation, but maybe focusing more on education and counter-narratives rather than jumping straight to censorship. We need to somehow stop the manufacturing of the infamous identity by attacking why it seems appealing in the first place.
Okay, so can you give some concrete examples? Policies that tackle this online component without necessarily becoming full-blown platform regulators?
Certainly. One policy concept could focus on establishing proactive counter-narrative programs. What does that mean? It means using educational and psychological experts to actively de-glamorize the shooter archetype in digital spaces.
Ah, okay.
This isn't about banning content per se. It's about funding specialized teams to inject different content. Content that reframes the action from distorted heroism to, frankly, pathetic failure.
Targeting the narratives consumed by high-risk groups. That's really educational policy, not platform policing.
That's a creative angle, focusing on psychological inoculation, kind of, rather than just trying to force removal. Right. Another example could be suggesting policy discussion around platform responsibility. Responsibility specifically in identifying and disrupting online communities that clearly validate or encourage the performance crime motivation. This moves the focus from just reporting the crime after the fact to potential early intervention within those online environments. You could leverage AI, human expertise to spot patterns of radicalization tied to this specific pathology. It shifts some of the burden of identification onto the ecosystem where the pathology is actually thriving.
This has been incredibly helpful, really providing the kind of depth and structure this analysis deserves. Let's just quickly summarize the key actionable advice for the author.
Okay. First, bolster that cultural critique. Acknowledge the counter-narratives, the systemic issues like economic precarity, and frame the self-esteem deficit as a facilitating condition. That really improves the academic robustness.
Right. Second, strengthen the policy memo structure. Map the solutions, like those conflict resolution courses, directly to the specific psychological deficits, like the victim mentality. Make it a clear, persuasive clinical prescription.
Exactly. And third, deepen the prevention strategies for that performance crime aspect. Move beyond just traditional media controls. Introduce policies, maybe like those counter-narrative programs that specifically target the online validation ecosystems where that desire for infamy is really fostered.
This is genuinely exceptional research. It makes some really sharp, necessary connections between psychological deficits and these broader cultural shifts. These refinements, I think structural, contextual, they could turn what's already a great analysis into truly indispensable policy material.
Keep pushing that depth and clarity. You've got a very, very strong framework here to build on.
We definitely look forward to seeing the refined document once you've had a chance to implement this critique. Please feel free to submit the material back in again for further review. Until next time, keep writing and keep critiquing.